everyone. Now, I know that it's hard to keep up on top of what's going on in the Holy Land, but if you want to know more about what's happening here in Israel, I'm Aaron Porras, and this is the Weekly Review. Starting today's news in the south, explosive and incendiary balloon terror from the Gaza Strip is continuing to increase sharply. Israel retaliating in more ways than one. Dozens and dozens of fires, burning Israeli nature preserves, fields, and farmland, caused by non-stop incendiary balloons and kites flown into southern Israel from the Gaza Strip all week long. At least 24 fires breaking out around Israeli civilian communities on Wednesday this week alone. Palestinian militants from the Hamas-run Strip resuming these indiscriminate acts of aggression in full force, after essentially stopping the practice for a period of several months. Israeli authorities, meanwhile, calling on citizens to stay away from and report all suspicious balloons, while the army takes heavy steps to curb the use of these crude and cheap yet destructive balloons, including airstrikes against Hamas military positions. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issuing heavy warnings on Tuesday to all would-be aggressors.
שיבחתי את הפעולה של חיל האוויר, אני רוצה להעביר לכל הגרורות של איראן, לרבות בעזה. יהיה מחיר כבד מאוד לטרור הבלונים, אנחנו לא נסבול את זה, אנחנו נפעל ונגבה מחיר יקר. עשינו את זה בעבר, כדאי שיזכרו זאת, כי נעשה זאת גם עכשיו.
In addition to retaliatory strikes, though, Israel is now punishing Gaza by halting fuel shipments to the Strip. The Gaza fishing zone has also been halved from 15 nautical miles to just 8. Not to punish the civilians in the Strip, however, Israel is still allowing and indeed supporting financial aid payments from Qatar to flow into Gaza. Doha has been paying millions of dollars to the people of Gaza in installments for years, nearly $1 billion since 2012, with the payments scheduled to expire come this September. Moving north to Lebanon now, the long-operating UN interim force in Lebanon, or UNIFIL, is at risk of dissolution. The United States is threatening that it may veto the resolution to extend UNIFIL's mandate. Due for a mandate extension vote on August 31st, the peacekeeping force stationed along the border between Israel and Lebanon is charged with maintaining the calm between the two countries. And currently, UNIFIL is even joining in on the humanitarian aid efforts in Beirut. But Israel charges that the unit is ineffective in its intended mission. As for years, Iranian proxy terror group Hezbollah has been threatening Israeli sovereignty and preventing UNIFIL from properly performing its duties. The United States then now backing Israel's allegations, pressuring the UN to remove restrictions on UNIFIL's movements or dissolve the organization entirely. Meanwhile, Israel and the United States are increasing Israel's defensive capabilities. The American and Israeli defense establishments successfully testing the all-new Arrow 2 ballistic missile interceptor.
The target missile was launched toward the state of Israel from the Mediterranean Sea. The system radar, the Green Pine, acquired the target and tracked on it till the moment that interceptor was launched toward the target.
It's been a few days since Russia announced massive news in the fight against coronavirus, an allegedly effective vaccine. And Israel is now getting in on Moscow's action. Nittany Manson with the details.
Just 48 hours have passed since President Vladimir Putin's historic announcement that Moscow has successfully created a vaccine for the COVID-19 pandemic and will be rolling it out to the public as soon as possible. And now, making sure that the vaccine is up to snuff, Israeli hospitals are enlisting their help. Looking at the rushed development and rollout of Russia's inoculation, many world nations are retaining their skepticism. International health officials claiming that there just hasn't been enough time to conduct proper human trials and to test the product for safety. Israeli Health Minister Yuli Edelstein similarly saying that Israel would be interested only after getting more proof. But rather than passively waiting for the results, Israeli authorities are recruiting hospitals to collaborate in clinical trials, the Hadassah University Medical Center being among them. Meanwhile, Israeli treatment's also making progress. The first 3 patients given a so-called passive vaccine now recovered and released from hospital. The passive vaccine, essentially just blood plasma with antibodies and antivirus proteins, proving to be effective. Good news coming none too soon, though. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu now unveiling new plans to reopen public life, starting with more economic incentives and a target date to return students to school.
קיימתי עכשיו ישיבה לגבי פתיחת שנת הלימודים עם שר החינוך, שר הבריאות, שר האוצר וראש המל"ל. אנחנו עושים הכל כדי לאפשר את פתיחת הלימודים ב1 בספטמבר, זה תאריך היעד, הוא גם לא השתנה. מה שאנחנו גם דואגים לכך שיהיו כל האמצעים, המשאבים הכספיים, החומריים והארגוניים על מנת לעשות את הדבר הזה שהוא חשוב לכל אזרחי ישראל.
This as the health ministry reports the closure of coronavirus drive-in testing centers over lack of demand, as well as the supposed deadliest 24 hours since the start of the pandemic. New infections in the country reaching a total of over 88,700. Active cases rising to 23,400, and 21 people succumbing to the virus, bringing the new total to 643.
A controversial and very high-profile bill hit the Knesset floor today. The draft legislation essentially taking aim at Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu by barring any lawmaker under indictment from forming a government. But with 53 votes opposed and only 37 in favor, the opposition-led proposal has been shut down. Netanyahu calling the bill's sponsor, opposition leader Yair Lapid of the Yesh Atid party, a dictator. He adds that the only places in the world where laws like these are passed are in dictatorships like Iran and North Korea. Now, I know what you're thinking. There are 120 Knesset members, but only 90 voted. So what happened to the final quarter of the government? Well, the opposition's Yamina party abstained from the vote, apparently to avoid confrontation with Netanyahu in the future. And then despite ongoing clashes between Netanyahu's Likud party and his partner, Benny Gantz's Blue and White did not show up for the vote either. Voting on such a bill would go against the unity agreement signed between them. Meanwhile, as for the budget crisis threatening to dissolve the government and throw Israel back to elections, the Knesset has passed a bill in its first reading today to delay the budget deadline from August 25 until November. Surprise anti-war protests made their way through Tel Aviv this week, but demonstrators had their focus set not on conflicts between Israel and Gaza or Iran or Lebanon, but rather on the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Nittany Manson with the story.
Upwards of 500 people, immigrants to Israel from Azerbaijan, lining the streets by the Jaffa port on Monday. The protest, organized by the Azerbaijan House, the Azerbaijan Jewish Diaspora Organization in Israel, coming in response to the latest Armenian provocation against Azerbaijan, the most recent outbreak of violence in a decades-long conflict over the Nagorno-Karabakh and surrounding regions of Azerbaijan. Though the latest exchange of fire takes place nearly 300 kilometers or 200 miles away from the Armenian-occupied Nagorno-Karabakh territory. Breaking a shaky ceasefire along the Armenian-Azeri border July 12th, Armenian and Azerbaijani officials accused one another of shelling both military and civilian positions on either side. The fighting then exploding over the following days, leading to the deaths of at least one civilian and 16 soldiers, including an Azerbaijani major general.
Sərhəd bölgələrinə amansızcasına ağır mərmilərdən, ağır artilleriyadan ateş açdılar. Ayın növbəti gecə səhərə kimi atdılar. Axşam saat 12-dən səhər 7-yə kimi atmadılar. Saat 7-də təzədən başladı. Dünənki gündə ayın 14-cü günü tezdən atıldı. 14-cü günü tezdən nədir? 7-də 8 işləmiş başladılar.
Danışanda atırdılar. Dedi ki, atırlar, başlayıblar. Onu da səs gəlir. Dedi, eşidirsən? Dedim, eşidirəm. Dedim, baba, bir yerdə, yəni çölə bayıra çox eləmə. O da səhər-səhər idi. Yəqin kuxnanın qabağında olub düz. Yəqin ki, çörək yiyib çıxırmış o yana keçməyəmi, yəni necə mərmi düşüb. Yəni onu... Yəni ölən vaxtı, mərmi düşən vaxtı yanında heç kim olmuyor.
Thousands of protesters gathering in the Azeri capital of Baku then, marching in solidarity with the Azeri army and chanting, "Karabakh, our homeland is indivisible." But there's much more to this story than just the recent clashes. The Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, beginning with the disintegration of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, has never really ended. Both former Soviet nations, Azerbaijan and Armenia, lay claim to the region between them. The international community, though, does recognize Nagorno-Karabakh and the 7 adjacent regions occupied by Armenia as sovereign Azerbaijan territory. Now, meanwhile, back in Israel, the 400-strong demonstration marched through the southern Tel Aviv Jaffa port, arriving at the Armenian Cultural Center and Armenian Church. Protest organizers explaining, though, that the demonstration was peaceful and not intent on provoking the Armenian Culture Center or the church. Rather, as citizens of Israel, they simply felt that as Armenia has no official representation in Israel, the Armenian Culture Center and church were the most suitable spot for the rally. Then, beginning with a minute of silence in honor of the recently killed, the rally moved on to playing hymns from the state of Israel and Azerbaijan, followed by demands for Israel to pressure Armenia and for Armenia to comply with the 4 UN Secretary Council's resolutions on this matter. The UN calling for Armenia to withdraw its armed forces from the Nagorno-Karabakh and 7 adjacent regions, and to allow nearly 1 million Azeri refugees to return to the land.
Lebanese government ministers are now resigning from their posts en masse, acquiescing to demands of protesters outside, and this just 1 week into the wake of a deadly catastrophic explosion in Beirut.
نحن اليوم نحتكم إلى الناس إلى مطلبهم بمحاسبة المسؤولين عن هذه الكارثة المختبئة منذ 7 سنوات، إلى رغبتهم بالتغيير الحقيقي من دولة الفساد والهدر والسمسرات والسرقات إلى دولة القانون والعدالة والشفافية، إلى دولة تحترم أبنائها. أمام هذا الواقع نتراجع خطوة إلى الوراء للوقوف مع الناس كي نخوض معركة التغيير معهم. نريد أن نفتح الباب أمام الإنقاذ الوطني الذي يشارك اللبنانيون في صناعته. لذلك أعلن اليوم استقالة هذه الحكومة. الله يحمي لبنان.
That's right, the Lebanese Prime Minister Hassan Diab, and indeed the whole government, is resigning now amidst growing public fury, beginning with criticisms of the government's handling of a financial crisis, then the coronavirus, and now the Beirut blast. Especially following revelations that government officials knew explosive ammonium nitrate at the Beirut port had been there for years, stored haphazardly and waiting like a time bomb. Worse yet, at least 20 more containers of dangerous chemicals have now been discovered to still be at the port, several punctured and leaking after being damaged by last week's blast, which killed over 200, injured thousands, and left homeless nearly 1/3 people. Most government resignations are seemingly coming from a position of solidarity with the people, though, and not shame.
أنا الاستقالة كمان هي مسؤولية، نحن استقلنا كمان مسؤولية مش هروبا من المسؤولية.
Resigning Lebanese Justice Minister Marie-Claude Najem, similarly saying that they're not running away from responsibility, but that no one wants to be in power under such circumstances, and that she challenges anyone to put themselves in the government's shoes. The political change-up not without its massive challenges, though. Prime Minister Diab's appointment itself being the result of months of struggles following the resignation of his predecessor, Saad Hariri, last October. Public Works Minister Michael Najjar saying that he hopes the next caretaking government period will not be as long. Meanwhile, Iran is watching the events in Lebanon unfolding closely, under a magnifying glass, with real fears that its years of influence in Lebanon via its terror proxy Hezbollah might be at risk. Hezbollah receiving a good portion of the protesters' fury for alleged involvement in the Beirut explosion, as well as being behind much of the country's corrupt mismanagement. One popular Lebanese blogger's criticism in particular going viral worldwide.
إسرائيل شو عملت فينا أكتر من اللي أنتم عملتوه فينا. إسرائيل شو عملت فينا أكتر من اللي أنتم عملتوه فينا. جاوبني. إذا قدرت تجاوب على هيدا السؤال بخيي اللي بدك بنجسد لك. جاوب على هالسؤال.
Now, also repeating a critical view of Hezbollah to the north in Lebanon, Israeli Defense Minister and alternate Prime Minister Benny Gantz. Gantz is warning that Israel's next war with Hezbollah, whenever that may be, will likely be infinitely more difficult to fight due to the terror group's practice of storing munitions amongst civilian populations. This becoming a hardened fact in Israel's eyes in light of the last week's explosion in Beirut. Gantz explains that in Lebanon, in the same house, there may be a guest room and a missile room, and that the IDF as a security network must therefore fight enemies that keep weapons and operate in civilian surroundings. So if there's no choice but to fight, the Lebanese people will be those suffering the most dire consequences. Meanwhile, though, these comments come as Israel is actually scaling back its reinforcements on the Lebanese border, in assumptions that Hezbollah is unlikely to mount attacks in the coming weeks. Instead, forces are focusing more on the south, A recent rise in the use of explosives tied to balloons floating from Gaza into Israeli communities, driving Israel to retaliate against Hamas positions in the Gaza Strip and close the Kerem Shalom crossing to commercial goods. In other news, justice is being served 10 years after an attack killing 2 IDF soldiers. Such are the words of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu speaking on the phone with Miriam Peretz, mother of Major Eliran Peretz, who was killed alongside Staff Sergeant Ilan Sviatkovsky in March 2010. The pair, attacked by suspected terrorist from Gaza Abdullah Dagma. Dagma had been detained by the Shin Bet Security Service in July 2020 after entering Israel to donate bone marrow to his brother. And during questioning with the Shin Bet, it was discovered that Dagma was likely involved in the 2010 attack in question. And he's been indicted now on 2 charges of murder in a Beersheba district court. Back to coronavirus now. Singaporeans breaking hygiene or distancing rules may soon need to look out because an Israeli-made drone will be watching. Police in Singapore are testing 2 fully automated drones developed by Israeli company Aerobotics in hopes that the UAVs can help enforce social distancing measures amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. The small pilotless drones, weighing just 10 kilograms or 22 pounds, are programmed to track anomalies and live stream what they see back to their operator.
We want to see these drones in every city in the world. Predominantly, since we believe that the system can really save lives, there's several applications that can relate to that. The simplest one is, if there's a fire somewhere in the city, and the drone would usually get there quicker than the fire truck. And being able to transmit video of the fire, of the location to the fire truck before it even gets there, could really save lives, and that applies to additional emergency response applications. So we think and we believe that this technology will become common in every city around the world.
Then, in addition to emergency responses or surveillance, aerobotics drones can be made available for a host of industrial purposes. But for now, aiding the Singaporean government's widespread surveillance program is the focus, with eyes set on other governments in the very near future. Moving on, new archaeological evidence discovered in Jerusalem is now providing added support for the Bible's telling of history, specifically an event so grand and dramatically violent that it permanently altered the magnetic field, the destruction of the first Jewish temple.
In our excavations here, we unearthed a building, and the building was heavily destroyed by fire. When we excavated, we saw tons of stones, pottery smashed on the floor, and wooden beams that were burnt. Everything is indicating a very violent destruction. Within the debris of the destruction, we saw fragments of floor of very high quality. Floor should be the last thing that we see. Everything should be lying on the floor.
This monumental floor that was exposed here gave us the rare opportunity to reconstruct the magnetic field of the Earth at the 9th of Av, 586 BCE, since it contains magnetic minerals. Once this floor was heated to very high temperatures, they all aligned with the magnetic field of the Earth of the time. By the work we did in the Paleomagnetic Laboratory in the Hebrew University, we could reconstruct the magnetic field of the Earth at this very specific time in the past.
So essentially using the date of a catastrophe that we know of, the Tisha B'Av destruction of the Jewish temple in 586 BCE, scientists are able to reconstruct the exact magnetic makeup of the Earth nearly 2,600 years ago. And according to researchers involved in the excavations, the purpose of this study was twofold. One, to rediscover the direction and magnitude of the magnetic field on the day of Jerusalem's destruction. And two, to understand what the magnetic data recorded in the floor fragments of the temple can tell us about the destruction itself. Well, exactly as described in the Torah, the archaeological and magnetic data confirms that a grand building on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem had been destroyed by fire and probably intentionally. All right, for this next story, prepare for your jaw to drop, because as innovators around the world are doing everything they can to reduce costs of PPE amidst the pandemic, these Israelis have a very different agenda.
My name is Isaac Levy, owner and designer of the fine jewelry brand UNIFIL, based out of Jerusalem, Israel. And I am very happy and proud to lead this amazing project of COVID-19 mask, which is the most expensive mask in the world today.
Made of 18-karat white gold and encrusted with 3,600 black and white diamonds, this face mask easily boasts the title of most expensive, and likely most ostentatious face mask on Earth. But more than just looks, this mask still comes better than the standard N95s used for coronavirus today.
It is a mask like any other mask, even more protective, just a little bit heavier and a little bit more expensive.
Actually, just a bit more expensive, coming with a whopping $1.5 million price tag. But still, UNIFIL jewelry owner Isaac Levy justifies the cost, calling the golden PPE a work of art, and explaining that the buyer is one of the biggest art collectors in the world.
Gentleman is a Chinese gentleman that we know from years ago. He lives in the United States. He's a young, old customer of ours. Very charming, very outgoing, very wealthy, and he likes to stand out. So I guess that's one of his ways of doing that. He lives in the United States, and he most probably is going to use it. I don't know. I don't think he's going to use it going to the supermarket, but he's going to use it here and there, I'm sure.
Levy also points out that at least some of the income does trickle down to many who need it. At least 25 artisans working on the piece.
We're very proud to be able to create such a mask that provides so much work to so many people that desperately need these jobs in these challenging times.
To the layman, though, the artistry is mostly lost. Israelis on the street, for one, suggesting that just maybe the money could be better spent.
I think it's a very expensive mask. I think instead to buy that mask, he could maybe invest into finding the cure to the coronavirus. But, you know, to the end of the day, he has own money, so he's able to do whatever he wants. Who knows, maybe one day I can buy one for her.
No, thank you. I don't want a mask that expensive.
And that's it for ILTV's Weekly Review. I'm Aaron Porras. See you next week.